Hello, I will be lecturing on Reading 26 Safety First, a reality-based approach to teens and drugs. This is by Marsha Rosenbaum, published 2012. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of get into it. Before you listen to my lecture, please read the introduction section on this part 10 of our textbook, Drug Prevention and Treatment, pages 333 to 336. But all right, moving on to slide number 3 here, understanding teen drug usage. So starts out looking at some statistics related to teenage drug use here. The 2010 Monitoring the Future survey. This is a survey, that looks at, a large survey looking at junior high and high school students across our country. Regarding drugs, they found that 48% of high school seniors had tried illegal drugs at some point in their lifetime. 38% had used drugs during the past year. 23, almost 24% used drugs in the last month. Regarding alcohol, they said 72% had tried alcohol, 65% had used it in the last year, and 41% had used it in the last month, almost twice the rate of marijuana. The CDC 2009 reported 21% of high school students reported consuming alcohol before age 13. All right, moving on to slide number 4 here, understanding teenage drug usage. Provide some context and says, Americans, we are constantly bombarded with messages of legal drugs, alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, pharmaceuticals, over-the-counter drugs, etc. She argues, drugs are an integral part of our life here in our society, and that's, we see that it's everywhere, whether it's, to boost our energy, to modify our moods, lift us out of depression, help us work, study and sleep, it says, she cites 8 out of 10 adults in the U.S. use at least one medication every week and half take a prescription drug, So really looking at the context of drugs in our society here, and the context and, what kind of message is this sending our children when they see this reflected in our society versus the message they receive from, these school drug programs here. It says 1 in 2 adults use alcohol regularly. 104 million Americans over the age of 12 have tried marijuana at some time in their lives. So really looking at, the prevalence that takes place in our society. Also talks about the riddleization of America's youth, specifically among students, but that we've talked a lot about this in previous articles, how common it is for Ritalin to be used by students. And a lot of this, some blame this on peer pressure for blame for teenage drug use. But we also see, looking at this Ritalization of America's youth, the stresses that are placed academically in our society, fast-paced society, where often students use it, to feel they need to use it to keep up with the stresses, the expectations of society. So like I said, some people blame peer pressure, but she says this is more instead about mirroring modern American drug taking tendencies. It's easy for parents, adults, society to blame it on peer pressure, but she's saying, look at what's going on in our American society, our drug taking tendencies. Like, if you want to look at peer pressure and these influences, look at the influences of adults in our society, and how many of them are taking some form of, drug, whether it's over the counter, prescription, using, alcohol, cannabis, all of these different things here, so it's not arguing, this isn't just so much about peer pressure, we could get away from peer pressure and just look at the reflection of what's going on in our society. And just touching on that point, we've talked a decent amount about it in our class. That's why I like doing these media assignments. But, once again, we can think of, the messages that are, received through our media. They say America's youth is encouraged to be drug free, but, they really aren't given a message about that, when you look at our media, movies and TV shows, alcohol, drug use, consumption is prevalent throughout, so many different resources, or I'm sorry, media sources, television shows, movies here, you know, how normal it is for, you know, alcohol, drinking to that, happy hour, all of these different things here, you know. So, you know, can really look at a lot of these different ways of, you know, what is reflected in our society. All right, so moving on to slide number 5, problems with current prevention strategies here. You know, so she comes and says, you know, we've been trying to prevent teen drug use for over a century, and it hasn't worked. You know, we look at usage rates among, you know, students, and yeah, they've declined a little bit, but they've been relatively stagnant. And ultimately, you know, we see a population of our youth are consume drugs regardless of the different, you know, strategies they've employed. She offers some reasons why, you know, one of the reasons, use versus abuse. You know, she says we pretend there's no difference between, you know, use and abuse here. Which, you know, is really kind of contrary to what they see in adult behavior and patterns and their own lives. You know, you know, when, I really like to start this article off when we're in class talking about the DARE program in class, the messages you were received. We've talked about this prior in the semester, you know, but this is something that, you know, use versus abuse wasn't taught in these school programs. It's that any use, you know, is going to lead to this gateway and you're going to become a druggie. You know, consuming any drugs is bad. We can look at the terror management program that was related to methamphetamines, you know, saying just once, and this is still currently taking place, you know. But, you know, students, people see these adult behaviors and they realize there's use versus abuse. You know, my parents have, you know, a few drinks throughout the week, but they're not alcoholics. They're using it in a, you know, in an appropriate manner, you know, so they get messages from their school programs that conflicts with the messages they see in their everyday lives here. Another thing here, scare tactics and misinformation here. You know, this is something, we've talked a lot about and throughout the semester, looking at the terror management program, looking at Reefer Madness, the article by Harry Anslinger, but, you know, using marijuana as a case in point, you know, and it's based on this idea, you know, teens see something risky, they won't do it, and these scare tactics are going to work, but this is not true here. You know, we've seen that these scare tactics, these different programs did not prove effective for students, and oftentimes, you know, just kind of took away legitimacy from the authorities. When you have people coming and saying, you know, you're going to smoke marijuana, then you're going to turn to crack, then heroin, and be a druggie, and then you smoke some cannabis, and you don't turn into a druggie like the you know, the DARE program has told you, like the teachers, all this, then, you know, this really creates distrust for authority here. But, you know, what we see is we still teach misinformation to students, and they distrust, you know, these authorities and listen to none of it. So, you know, they use these scare tactics that were really used during the DARE program. You know, students realized this was not accurate information and, you know, distrusted all of the information, you know. So this idea of, you know, these scare tactics, these dishonest drug programs in the school were not effective here. Another thing talks about is potency. You know, we teach some marijuana today is significantly more potent today than before here. She says, you know, reality, it's slightly more potent on average, likening to the difference between a cup of tea versus an espresso. People just drink less. So, you know, yes, I will, you know, the cannabis, especially now, she wrote this in 2012, is significantly stronger here. But this is something that people are aware of, you know. And I mean, I talked to a lot of people and asked them about this, and a lot of people I know are just like, yeah, I get the cheap stuff. I don't want the really good cannabis because it's too strong for me and I don't enjoy it. So, you know, yeah, there is an element of being potency, but, you know, I think people are aware of this and, you know, they will consume more. It's not that, oh my gosh, this weed is so strong and I just am going to smoke dabs all day, every day. Yes, some people do that, but, you know, the reality is, you know, you're probably going to take less. And those are people who get, you know, start to use, cannabis on a very, very regular basis, and that's taken place throughout time. You know, regardless of potency, you're always going to have a small group who's going to get highly involved in that. But anyways, all right, so moving on. the idea of addiction here, she says, we teach them it's physically addictive and that more people are checking themselves into rehab for marijuana addiction. So she's talking about cannabis addiction. The reality is, yes, this can produce a psychological dependence. It's not like a physical dependence, like think of the withdrawals that we've talked about with heroin and opium problems. But what she says is this is also, a statistic that's a little biased because more people are going to court-ordered rehab for marijuana offenses. So this is something, people try to cite fighting against cannabis. Much more people are going into rehab for cannabis. So clearly this is an issue. Clearly it's addictive. Yes, it has a physiological dependence, but we see that a lot of these times people are going for rehab for marijuana is court-ordered. They got in trouble with the law, and instead of doing time, they have the option to do a court-ordered rehab here. Next, she talks about the gateway theory. I wish we were in class. I always like kind of talking about this, asking students how many people believe the gateway theory. This is something that was very commonly understood as real, and it still is today. This was put out, and once again, this just gets at the fact of, when media puts stuff out, when it's out there and it gets it wrong, people rarely pay attention or focus when, we've seen the news, oh, we apologize, we inaccurately reported something. It's always just a little asterisk at the end of the show. It's never the headline story. Hey, we got the gateway theory wrong, But this idea of, teaching them that using marijuana will lead to the use of other hardcore drugs. This is the gateway theory. There is no statistical significance that validates this. There's been statistics that have been, curtailed to try to show evidence of this. But the reality is this is not true. This is, an oversimplification. And, when you think about it, most hardcore users did start using cannabis because it's widely accessible, and that's pretty much the first, drug that most people try. But the vast majority of those that use marijuana never go on to use, much less abuse hardcore drugs, So this is very backwards, skewed thinking, this gateway theory. And like I said, the statistics that people have shown has been disproven time and time again, but people will still try to prove their point through statistics. So if you think about it, anybody who's doing heroin or very hardcore drugs, not the chances of someone doing those drugs without, trying cannabis is highly, highly unlikely. Very rare that somebody goes straight into heroin or something, But that doesn't mean that cannabis is the gateway to drug. It's just that somebody who has the type of behavior that's maybe risk-taking behavior enough, whatever it may be, to try these much more dangerous drugs like heroin, are clearly going to be open to the idea of using cannabis. And using these statistics to try to prove that, it's just, it is not accurate one bit here, and it's this idea of correlation does not equal causation. Yeah, the majority of people who do heroin and are addicted tried cannabis, but that correlation does not equal causation. I've talked about this in class. It's this idea that if you're eating popsicles put you at a higher risk of drowning. Okay, yeah, you could look at that statistically too, as true, but there's no causation. The reason that's the place is because people are eating popsicles. It's on a hot day. They're more likely to be around swimming pools and therefore more likely to drown. So that is just skewing statistics to try to make a point that is not valid, and that's exactly the case with the gateway theory here. It's completely backwards thinking. The statistics don't make sense, and you can use countless examples of how this is not true. The clearest example I like to try to provide, I actually saw this from a politician. I can't remember who it was, but anyways, they said, if we're arguing the gateway theory is true and based off of those statistics, and you want to say this is valid and reliable, then milk is a gateway to bourbon. Everybody who's ever drank bourbon has drank milk. So if you provide those statistics, then milk is a gateway to bourbon. But you see what I mean? That's just skewing the statistics, and it's a natural progression. You could use this for countless things. You could say bad driving is a gateway to good driving, because everybody starts out as a bad driver and then ends up becoming a good driver. But you can see that, this statistics, this ideology here is completely skewed, but it's still very pervasive in our society. But ultimately, it's about a lot of complex issues and factors, dependent on, the individual and social factors as to why they would, move on to use harder drugs. But yeah, this gateway theory is completely invalid. No credible research points to this, and it is not true one bit. And, like I said, it looks at a lot of different factors, but the person who is likely to do heroin is, going to try cannabis, but so anyways, I'm going to move on. If you want to have some more questions or you want to talk more about this, I could provide you some articles or some research. But anyways, all right, moving on. Looking into lung cancer here, she says we teach them smoking marijuana causes lung cancer. The reality, it irritates pulmonary systems, but there hasn't been a lot of valid research that says, smoking cannabis causes lung cancer here. And also, there's different research, but this is something that has not been, completely proven true one bit, but this is something that is often used here. So what they say is, ultimately, we have this asterisk down here, that it's not that no drug is completely safe, but, the author's just pointing out and disagreeing with the mischaracterization of marijuana as the root of all drug evils and the cause of all of this. Like, honestly, do you really believe if in our society we got rid of all of the cannabis in our country, somehow, some way, I don't know how we do it, that somehow all other drug usage rates would stop? I got a feeling they'd probably even increase even more. That's me speculating. Don't hold on to it. But think about that. If that's really this gateway theory is what it's arguing, do you really honestly believe that if we got rid of all cannabis in our country, nobody would be doing any other drugs? I'm going to go out on a limb and say no, but this is purely speculation. And for a guy who keeps talking about science and based evidence, I get, but I think we can take a guess on that one. All right, moving on to slide number 6 here. This idea of just say no or nothing at all here. This is drug education almost solely focuses on prevention here, and there's little to no attention given to moderation or harm reduction here. And, this is ultimately, getting at this idea of, eventually we need to rethink this and provide a more accurate and realistic drug education program for our students. With that being said, this is a very, very touchy subject. Imagine telling parents, hey, we're going to provide, a harm reduction approach to our drug education in school and say, hey, we know you're going to be doing drugs. We know some of you are going to try these. You have interest. Here is safe ways to consume this. Here is what to look out for, all of these things. Like, I think a lot of us could agree, yeah, that's the information that students need, and to be able to have honest conversations regarding drugs so that they can ask questions and it's not such a taboo thing where they can talk to adults. But, you could imagine a lot of parents are not going to be happy about that. These take place in the public schooling system. A lot of parents are not going to be like, hey, I'm not paying taxes and sending my kid to public school to teach them that, there's safer ways to use drugs. So, a lot, it's understandable, but ultimately, this just gets at our weird relationship with drugs in our society and, kind of this misinformation, skewed perspectives, and, ultimately we still aren't having an accurate, honest discussion about drugs in our society. But, so there's really no attention to trying this moderation, harm reduction. And they say the reality is most students don't just say, just so, yeah, what? Sorry, that's a typo in there. But just say yay. But, the reality is most students, maybe sometimes even yes, but a lot of students don't just, try drugs a lot. We look at rates. Yeah, there's higher rates, but look at all of the rates of people who don't try drugs. If this peer pressure, all these different things were so prevalent, why isn't it we see higher numbers? But ultimately it's, this idea of giving them tools to manage this and use effectively and responsibly, navigating these, the complexities of being a young student, and being exposed to, drugs and alcohol, and the best way, just get, Nancy Reagan's just say no, that whole thing, how much money was spent on it. That's just not realistic, and students aren't going to do that. And that doesn't honestly arm students and young adults with, the skills needed to navigate, being exposed to drugs and alcohol at a young age, and we need to provide them with more realistic, accurate information, as opposed to just telling students all drugs are bad. You smoke weed, you're going to get hooked on heroin, and the only way to deal with it is to just say no. That's not realistic. Any of us who can think about going through high school, these different things, that is so completely unrealistic. And it's kind of crazy when you think about how long this was the idea in our country and the program that was taking place here. Moving on to slide number 7. This is, safety first, a reality-based approach here. So, really arguing for, hey, let's focus on safety first and let's be realistic here. We can't keep kidding ourselves that we're going to be able to stop all of our kids from doing drugs or trying cannabis by telling them all to just say no and telling them that everything's a gateway. What's recommended? Provide honest, science-based information. What a crazy idea. I know I've been arguing this all semester, but instead of saying all these, talking about all these different things and providing these anecdotal reports, provide honest, science-based information. Our students, our kids are a lot smarter than we realize, and, they will respond well to this. Encourage moderation if they're going to experiment. Parents are going to have a big issue with this, but when you don't have these open conversations, then students are left to navigate these on their own and oftentimes engage in much more unhealthy usage, or taking too much of it, as opposed to providing more information, encouraging moderation. Promote the understanding of the legal and social consequences of drug use. That's the thing. Oftentimes it's portrayed that, it's these young students, high school kids, are just dumb. They have no idea. They're just given into peer pressure. They don't care about their future, all these different things, and they don't care about their health. But that's not true. When you look at studies and different things, students are concerned about their health. There's a lot of students who say, don't use cannabis or don't smoke cannabis because, they're concerned with their health. Students want to be aware of the legal consequences. No reality. They don't want to get in trouble. A lot of these, I can think back in high school, a lot of the kids who smoked cannabis, were, on their way to college, were really good students, bringing up, the legal repercussions. How can that influence it? Being realistic. They're going to respond well to that, as opposed to telling them just say no. And prioritize safety through personal responsibility and knowledge here. This idea of safety first through personal responsibility and knowledge when it comes to drugs is like, parents there's so many people that are just upset by this idea, think it makes no sense, and in no way should we be trying to provide this harm reduction and prioritize safety and personal responsibility and knowledge. But ultimately this is something we've done in our society, and we see pretty much with most of the topics related to high school students, we eventually arrive at a safety first idea. We see historically, I'll talk about this in a second, it was pushed back each time, but ultimately that's where we arrived. I'll talk about it in the safe sex model, but eventually we're going to have to arrive at this point. Like, I don't care where you're at, like at some point in time we're going to have to use the safe sex model here. But moving on to the next slide here, put safety first here. So we have the safety first. Parents, when it gets talked about in drugs, oftentimes there's a lot of pushback, but look at alcohol as a case in point here. Drug driving was a huge risk to the youth, directly and indirectly, whether you were driving and got killed or you were in a car with a friend here. But instead of just saying, just say no, all these things, don't do it, they started incorporating, different campaigns to try to educate students more about this. Designated driver campaigns have been wildly successful in teaching teens responsible ways to drink, even while underage, and have brought down rates of deaths due to drunk driving for teens. So, there's evidence that puts, the safety first. Education, instead of being like, don't drink and that's all there is to it, like, hey, we understand that you may drink, but drunk driving is incredibly risky. Here's the statistics. Schools have implemented these drunk driving programs where, you know, we've talked about it in class where, you know, they may pretend a student has died by a drunk driving accident, you know, and then they have to walk around school dead. So, you know, I think there's some benefits to those programs. On the other hand, I think they are a little sensationalized too much, but we talked about that in class. But ultimately, it is addressing this idea of a more realistic approach. Hey, you're going to drink, but please don't drive. So this is something that has, you know, shown positive results. The big thing here, though, safe sex model, you know, this is something we can look back, and historically this was, you know, had a very similar idea, right? You know, parents, the idea of safe sex model, teaching children, teaching our kids how to have safe sex, teaching them how to use a condom, teaching them about STDs. So many people were up in arms with that. Now we see that, you know, that is the given, and, you know, it's this idea of reducing harm. And at some point in time, we're going to need to adopt that in our society, involving drugs, you know, like there's no way, and alcohol, there's no way around, you know, high school students, junior high students are going to consume drugs, cannabis, and alcohol. So, you know, how can we provide them with the tools, the information, the knowledge to, you know, have them utilize that the safest, have the most accurate knowledge about it too. Here's the thing, when you just tell them just say no, they don't get accurate knowledge. They don't know the realities of it. So they're left to figure it out on their own and fend for their own, you know, and especially in today's society with media, internet, social media, you know, yeah, there's different perspectives, but, you know, students are going to see the other side of the coin, you know, just go on Instagram or anything, these different influences, you know, but ultimately I think this safe sex model really points a clear example of, you know, back in the day, something similar, people, you know, just really push back on it. But ultimately now I think we can all agree that, you know, promoting safe sex is a much better way than just promoting abstinence and telling everybody to just say no. So that's really a good model to think about in relation to, you know, our drug programs, our drug education for children in our country. So the last slide here, I'm just briefly going over this. If you're really interested, the textbook goes into much more detail on these topics here. But what's a parent to do? Number one, listen to what teens have to tell us about their lives and feelings. Oftentimes you talk to children, teens, you know, it just feels that their parents are lecturing them, telling them what's going on, and they don't actually listen to them. You know, also learn about the physiological, psychological, and sociological effects of alcohol and drugs so that we can address their questions and concerns. This is a very interesting thing here that takes place. You know, parents, you know, want this just say no, or, you know, some parents push for these drug education in schools because they don't want to deal with it at their homes. But then, you know, maybe they have issues with the drug education program. But, you know, that's another thing here. Parents need to learn also, and not just learn by going on the DARE website and learning how to just say no, but learning accurate knowledge related to these topics, physiological, psychological, sociological effects of alcohol and drugs, so they can address their questions, concerns, and have these conversations with their children. Yeah, a lot of parents have a conversation with their children about these topics. A lot of parents don't. They leave it to the schools to do this, or it's just something taboo or something they don't want to take on. And oftentimes, you know, this is because they don't have the knowledge, or the other thing is a lot of times parents do have these conversations and aren't equipped with accurate knowledge, so they're just perpetuating myths to their children. You know, ACT, drug abuse prevention, is not a curriculum package, this magic bullet. You know, make a plan. These are complex issues, you know, and really get together and act, you know, talk to other people, become knowledge, and really try to develop, you know, a overarching plan to, you know, provide the best information and ultimately, you know, the most realistic ways to keep our children safe, you know, from the harms of drugs and alcohol, and understand, you know, the complex issues surrounding them and how to engage in moderation if they are. You know, another thing, lead, you know, get involved. PTA and other parent groups often request safety first speakers for their meetings, you know, so get involved. You know, there's evidence, you know, a lot of, you know, if the school's not going to, you know, champion this cause of safety first, get involved, get in PTA, start bringing up these issues, inform parents, but ultimately, lead. If this is such a concern with our children and drugs and how passionate parents and activists can get, then all right, get involved with it instead of just relying on our schools, and help, know what to do if anyone is having a negative reaction to alcohol, drugs, become informed on these topics. All right, but pretty much finished up with this, but just want to touch upon, kind of briefly went through these slides. A lot of interesting things. I could go off a lot on these, but I don't want to provide you guys 2 hours of lecture for, one day. But ultimately, think about all these different things, but this idea of help, and being, important to know what to do if, believe a teenager, someone else is having, negative reactions or issues with drugs or alcohol. But ultimately, this gets at a lot of, once again, complex issues, but we see that, parents oftentimes, do look to schools for, these drug education programs. But I think, in our society, there's much more awareness. Parents, are becoming much more active, in understanding what's going on and having conversations with their children and talking to their children about this. But, the last point I want to make, when we look at research, all of these different things, what it ultimately points at is, the healthiest children, the healthiest kids, whether or not they experiment with drugs, have parents who are present, loving, and involved, and, ultimately talk to them, have these open discussions, So at the end of the day, as complex as this is, so many different sides to the coin on this, I think it's really important to really just point out that aspect, that whether your children experiment with drugs, having parents that are present, loving, and involved is the most important thing. And, I think that's a major, major factor. Obviously, so many that go into it, but I think, a lot of us can look back, and I can look back in high school and even college, and some of the smartest people or, successful people I knew, did use cannabis, did use drugs, but you look, and for the most part, most of them, did have really healthy families. Their parents were present and they were loved. And that's such a huge factor. And, I think ultimately it's important to remind that in this situation where as a parent, it can be overwhelming with, what approach, all the knowledge, all of these different things. But I think it's nice, a good point to really, ultimately point out that, the most important factor and, for raising your children, looking at rates of drugs, alcohol consumption, all these different things is were your parents there, were they, loving and involved, especially that last part, obviously loving, but involved. So, I have a list of just some resources and some videos if you want to check it out at the end of this, at the end of my presentation, but that's it for now. Yeah, if you have any questions, you want to discuss this, I always enjoy engaging in this topic, but all right, I'm done for now. Have a lovely day.